Hello and welcome, my gentle and of course very modern apes. Today I want to talk to you guys about one of the first members, if not the first member, of our genus, because a new paper has come out that is not directly challenging its status, but sort of subtly taking another look at it. This is K&M ER 1813, a cranium from Kubifora, Kenya, belonging to the oldest named species in our genus, genus Homo, Homo habilis, or the handyman. Homo habilis as a species is at least 2.3 million years old, but if we treat the Leddy-Gararu mandible, or the oldest mandible from genus Homo, as Homo habilis, then it is 2.8 million years old, older than genus Paranthropus. Compared to anatomically modern Homo sapiens, Homo habilis might not seem that impressive. The brain case is still pretty dang small, it's still relatively prognathic, and aspects of the teeth and face are reminiscent of Australopithecus as a genus. However, comparing Homo habilis to the most similar Australopith to it, represented here by the Mrs. Ples specimen of Australopithecus africanus, you can start to see some of the characteristics that define genus Homo to the exclusion of Australopithecus emerging, including a bigger brain case and a less prognathic face. To make an oversimplification complete, the reason Homo habilis is called handyman is because it was associated with stone tools when it was first discovered by the Leakeys in the 1970s. So at the time, the thing that held Homo habilis in place as this earliest member of genus Homo rather than a member of Australopithecus was a slightly larger brain case size, a slightly less snouty face, and tool use. Emphasis on that last part because you see, back in the day, tool use was considered to be one of, if not the main things that separated humans from basically the rest of the animal kingdom. And this notion of superiority was firmly put to rest after the work of Jane Goodall came in, showing that chimpanzees also use tools, and that train just never stopped as we discovered that numerous other animals actually do utilize tools, from cetaceans to proboscideans to birds. At that point, it was kind of sophisticated tools, and in the hominin lineage, that was the tool-using separation between Homo and Australopithecus, but then stone tools were found associated with genus Australopithecus at the site of Lamekwi. Now, they're pretty basic stone tools, and they might actually belong to a different hominin there, which also isn't genus Homo, Kenyanthropus platyops. Either way, Homo is not the only tool-using genus of hominin that we know of. More foundationally problematic with those Lamekwi tools is that they're older than Homo habilis at 3.3 million years of age, which means like Homo habilis couldn't have perhaps taught these other hominins how to use tools, or they didn't diverge from Homo habilis as tool users, meaning Homo habilis is firmly not the first tool-using hominin in the fossil record, and thus tool use can't be used to define genus Homo. You might be able to argue that it's a specific type of tool use, a specific industry of tools, but then that just becomes a difference in degree and not one of kind. And we typically don't like those as humans with, again, a bit of a narcissistic superiority complex. Well, okay, but you still have that large brain case size, right? That definitely separates Homo habilis and thus genus Homo from Australopithecus. Not really. You see, the mean brain case size for Homo habilis in a strict sense, so without lumping in some of the specimens that some paleoanthropologists think should be within Homo habilis and others think should be a distinct species, like Homo rudolfensis, that averages 611 cc's, and if you include some of these other maybe Homo habilis specimens, it spikes to about 666 cc's. And that average is in fact above the Australopithecus average, even if we're using the biggest brained members of genus Australopithecus. However, the smallest brained Homo habilis are actually smaller than the biggest brained Australopithecus. So the ranges between late Australopithecus and early genus Homo overlap, even if it's just a little bit. Now, you might just say, well, then why not call those big-brained Australopithecus early genus Homo and the small genus Homo Australopithecus? And the reason is because we don't decide where a species or where a specimen falls based off of a single characteristic. It's based off of suites of characteristics. And in this case, the overwhelming majority of the characteristics of small-brained Homo habilis landed with genus Homo, and specifically with Homo habilis, and the overwhelming majority of the characteristics of big-brained Australopithecus landed as a member of that genus. So basically what I'm saying is we've got something of a gradient here, don't we? Even the faces, that less prognathic face of Homo habilis is, like, not really as definitive as you might think, particularly if we're looking at all members of Australopithecus and all members of early genus Homo. It's weird because there are a lot of aspects of Homo habilis' morphology in general, and I'll go ahead and say Homo rudolfensis as well, really this entire suite of early genus Homo, that plant it, like, right mosaic right in between Australopithecus and what we would consider to be like really solid members of Homo erectus. So putting aside the brain case size and the tool use and the orthognathic face, its mouth is really weird, right? So it's got these smaller jaws as compared to Australopithecus, but then the canines are actually kind of big compared to the premolars for something in genus Homo. That looks more like Australopithecus, but the palate is also more parabolic than Australopithecus, putting it more in line with later genus Homo. The limb proportions look more like Australopithecus, but the actual morphology of the legs and of the foot look more like genus Homo. Like, for instance, the ankles are incredibly stable, which suggests to many that it's spending more time doing these long distance walks as compared to something like Australopithecus, which would have been completely at home on the ground, but is perhaps less efficient than something like Homo erectus. Like Homo habilis sits right in the middle there, but then the talus, right, so like portions of the ankle actually look more like ape ankles, specifically with regard to like how they can bear their weight, suggesting that they might have still been incorporating some kind of climbing into their adaptive regime. The hands are really strange, right? There are aspects of the wrist that look more ape-like, specifically in the scaphoid and the trapezium, but then you have these distal portions or like terminal portions of the phalanges that are flared, and they look more like genus Homo. It's got late genus Homo looking clavicles, but like Australopithecus-like arms, and that they're really long, and again, it looks like they're still doing some amount of climbing, albeit not as much as Australopithecus. The entire pelvic suite looks more like genus Homo, but again, this is compared with shorter legs, but then the head of the femur looks more like later genus Homo. And like, this is just off the top of my head. The minutiae take this even more extreme. The whole thing is a really great transitional species. But okay, where do you draw the line, right? Like, it's fine for me to sit here and say, wow, like Homo habilis occupies this really interesting spot in between what we currently consider late Australopithecus and what we consider like middle genus Homo, so things that are like firmly again within Homo erectus. But like, what does Homo habilis actually have that differentiates it from Australopithecus in such a clear way so as to mark it the first member of genus Homo as opposed to just another member of late genus Australopithecus? Like, why not call it Australopithecus habilis and just say that it is in fact late Australopithecus and that what we consider as firm Homo erectus is actually the first member of genus Homo? Well, some paleoanthropologists propose that we should do just that. So in 1999, Bernard Wood and Mark Collard released a paper titled The Changing Face of Genus Homo, and in it they make a pretty substantial argument that Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis shouldn't be included in genus Homo if we're deciding membership in the genus in a very specific way. So this is that paper from 1999, The Changing Face of Genus Homo by Wood and Collard. I had to read this for my hominin evolution class. It's a pretty like seminal work. And this thing is functionally open access. You can find it with a pretty basic Google search. You don't have to use any useful but not technically legal tools to access it. So by all means, go find it and read it and follow along. But I'm not going to just walk you through the paper, right? We're going to highlight some important notes here before we move on to another equally important paper, and then the new paper that we're discussing today that I think has some interesting implications for this entire argument. So, let's start here in the abstract. They say, we then demonstrate that the current criteria for identifying species of Homo are difficult, if not impossible, to operate using paleoanthropological evidence, or paleontological evidence generally if we're talking about non-hominin specific disciplines. We discuss alternative verifiable criteria and show that when these new criteria are applied to Homo, two species, Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis, fail to meet them. We contend that the lowest boundary of Homo should be redrawn so that the new earliest species of genus Homo is Homo ergaster, which is sometimes called early African Homo erectus. The appearance of this species at around 1.9 million years ago appears to mark a distinct shift in hominin adaptive strategies involving morphological and behavioral innovations. So there's a specific phrase here that I hope lit up for a few of you, but if not, I'm going to walk you through it. And that's a distinct shift in the hominin adaptive strategy. Whenever you hear that species or groups should be defined by their adaptive strategies, or even you just hear the term adaptive strategy in relation to things like taxonomy, what should come to mind almost immediately is the discussion of grades versus clades. Now, a clade is a phylogenetic unit, while a grade, which was sort of this alternative grouping system proposed by Julian Huxley, well, like I said, it has to do with defining groups by their adaptive regimes, or like their niches. In this sense, though, niche is pretty broad, and obviously a grade then is not going to actually tell us very much about the evolutionary history of an organism, which is why clades are typically used instead. A clade is always going to be amenable to like these monophyletic groups, whereas a grade, not so much. I realize that this isn't very helpful just like spitting these words at you if you don't have a background in it, so allow me to elucidate with a couple of examples. Alright, so in the background you can see a primate phylogenetic tree. Let's talk about grades and clades with regard to this specific tree. So we all know that humans are more closely related to chimpanzees, and chimpanzees more closely related to humans than either is to gorillas, and then that entire group is more closely related internally than any is to orangutans, and so on and so forth. And so because of that, we understand that humans are, of course, apes, but in a colloquial sense, and you see in the literature too, although it's typically defined, like it's said on the outset, so we kind of define our terms and know what we're talking about. When we say ape and we're talking to other people, a lot of the time we mean non-human grade apes. So in that sense, ape is a grade, right? Because it includes chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans to the exclusion of humans, despite the fact that humans and chimps are more closely related to one another, and then humans, chimps, and gorillas to the exclusion of orangutans, and so on and so forth. So grades are not going to reflect the actual phylogenetic relationship that we understand within Hominidae. So Hominidae, in a phylogenetic sense, is a nice monophyletic clade. It includes an ancestral hominid and all of the descendants. Great. But ape, in the colloquial sense, right, as we use with one another, is a grade and not a very informative one at that. You probably think of a second example here as well, as we've kind of walked through it, which is monkey, right? When we say monkey, we typically mean like tailed catarrhine primates to the exclusion of great apes. We like separate out, these are the monkeys and these are the apes. But phylogenetically speaking, right, great apes, including humans, are catarrhine monkeys. That's just the way that it is, right? It's the law of monophyly. You don't outgrow your ancestry. So in that sense, monkey is a grade, if we use it colloquially speaking, but catarrhine monkeys is a clade. And humans are, of course, catarrhine monkeys, and so are all of the other apes, and so on and so forth. So you might have heard the quip before that humans are fish, and that's kind of a misrepresentation because fish is a grade, and so it doesn't include humans. Like, that's because it is a grade, right? By utilizing fish, we're utilizing a grade that excludes tetrapods, because as you can see from this phylogeny here, we have three groups, right? So here's actinopterygians, so these are your ray-finned fish. Here's your sarcopterygians over here, and both of these are a part of a group called osteichthyes, the bony fishes, which is a sister group to the cartilaginous fishes, chondrichthyes, which are like sharks, rays, skates, etc. So what this means, right, using this phylogeny, is that tetrapods, including humans, are a type of sarcopterygian, which is a type of osteichthyan animal, right, osteichthyan vertebrate. So in this sense, we are fish, but fish isn't really a real term, right? We're actually sarcopterygians and osteichthyans and things of that nature. What I'm trying to say is that grades are super useful colloquially, but with regard to their application to phylogenetics, So moving back to the paper with wooden collared, let's continue onward. So what they do is they go over each of the members of genus Homo, in a broad sense, I suppose I should say. So they go over Homo neanderthalensis, they talk about Homo heidelbergensis, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, and then this sort of vague early Homo group of specimens. They talk about the changing functional interpretation of Homo habilis, saying that some aspects of Homo habilis have become reinterpreted to be more primitive than previously thought, especially in the light of other specimens. And then we get down to what I think is the most important part of this paper, which is like, how do we actually define genus Homo? And how do Wood and Collard suppose that we do define genus Homo? So in this section, have the limits of Homo been stretched too far? They say, depending on the type of taxonomic interpretation adopted, the genus Homo contains as many as seven fossil species. These species run the gamut of morphology from Australopithecus-like postcranial skeleton morphology and proportions of Homo habilis to the very different morphology and limb proportions of modern humans. Notwithstanding the existence of comprehensive morphological diagnoses of Homo, in practice, species have been assigned to the genus on the basis of 4 criteria. I don't know that that's the move here, right? Like, I don't know that it is right to say, notwithstanding all of these extensive empirical analyses that do in fact place these specimens that we consider to be Homo habilis as more closely aligned with, albeit slightly, genus Homo than the latest members of Australopithecus. Like, I don't know if you can just say, this has all been done, but functionally what people are actually doing is this. And Collard and Wood go on to give the criteria that they feel have been effectively utilized to define genus Homo. The first of these characteristics that's being used is brain case size, right? The first criterion concerns absolute brain size. And then they go on to the second, which is the possession of language. And like, this one has always rubbed me the wrong way. Now, granted, we're over 20 years out from this paper, so a lot has changed since then, and I certainly don't see anybody utilizing language as a criteria for being in genus Homo, or indeed talking much about language at all in ancient hominins, especially if we don't have like the hyoid or a good endocast to see if there's emphasis in like Broca's and Wernicke's region. The third is just tool use generally, which we already talked about at the beginning, and how that kind of fell out of favor quite some time ago. And then the fourth is the possession of a modern human-like precision grip based on a well-developed opposable pollex. So the pollex is the thumb, and just like the big toe is called the hallux, the big finger is called the pollex. After listing these criteria, they go on to say that every single one of these is problematic as like the defining suite of characters for being within genus Homo, and I completely agree. It's just I haven't seen anybody use these criteria in quite some time. And granted, that might be because of this paper. This paper might have been what pushed a lot of people over the edge in using those characteristics to be like, oh, we found another member of genus Homo because big brain, or because tools associated with it, or, because opposable grip in the precision grip in the hand. And I think largely that's borne out, right? Like, we know that the overall size of the brain isn't necessarily the only thing that is associated with cognition. It has a lot more to do with the wiring of that brain. We find that nice precision grip in a lot of hominins that aren't just genus Homo, and in association with that, we find stone tools with non-genus Homo hominins. Like I said earlier, we found them associated with either Australopithecus afarensis or Kenyanthropus platyops, and then last year we found some stone tools associated with genus Paranthropus. Now, whether or not Paranthropus was actually using those tools, or if perhaps the tools were being used on Paranthropus, we don't really know, but if we're being consistent, technically Paranthropus has been associated with stone tools. And like, to that point, right, chimpanzees technically use stone tools, so should they be in genus Homo, a la Louis Leakey's famous quote? But then Wood and Collard go on to talk about like, okay, well, if those criteria can't actually determine what should be in genus Homo, like, how should we actually do it? And in the next section, you can kind of sum it up with this section in bold here and what immediately follows, right? Cladistics is the most effective method of identifying monophyletic groups of species, but how can we best determine hominin adaptive strategies? For species to persist long enough to be sampled in the hominin fossil record, individuals must be able to maintain themselves in a homeostasis despite fluctuations in ambient temperature, humidity, and the availability of water. They also have to procure and process sufficient food to meet their minimum requirements for energy and essential nutrients, and last, they must be able to mate in order to produce offspring. The ways in which the members of a hominin species meet these fundamental requirements comprise the species adaptive strategy. And the implication of this and what precedes, and you can go read this for yourself, is that perhaps we should actually be defining a lot of these genera within human evolution by their adaptive strategies, rather than just looking at the best monophyletic relationship, right? Or maybe in addition to looking at the best monophyletic relationship. So they say that to be in genus Homo, conditions have to indicate that the species is more closely related to Homo sapiens than it is to Australopiths. Australopiths, which they use to say, like, okay, it could be Australopithecus, Paranthropus, or Ardipithecus. Second, functional analysis should indicate that the strategies used by the fossil Homo species to maintain homeostasis, acquire food, and produce offspring are more similar to the strategies used by Homo sapiens than they are to the strategies employed by Australopiths. Now, I've kind of teased what's going to come out of this paper, right? Which is that they're going to argue that Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis, according to those criteria, more closely resemble Australopiths than they do Homo sapiens, and thus they should be in genus Australopithecus. And like the problem that I have with that is that I think it assumes that there's going to be discovered, or that there already has been discovered, this big tangible jump between late Australopithecus and early genus Homo that will be or is clockable in the hominin fossil record in such a way so as, like, the very latest, if we had a perfect fossil record member of Australopithecus and the earliest member of genus Homo would still be able to be differentiated using whatever that criteria is, if it is in fact the set laid out by Collard and Wood here. Because otherwise, you're going to end up with turtles all the way down, right? Like, let's say that they're right and we put habilis into Australopithecus. Well, then the next oldest member of genus Homo would be Homo rudolfensis. Does it share more with the latest member of Australopithecus, which is now Australopithecus habilis, or Homo sapiens? Well, it shares more with Australopithecus habilis, so now it's going to also fall into Australopithecus. And now you look at the next one, Homo ergaster, or like African Homo erectus. Is it more similar to Homo rudolfensis or Homo sapiens? Well, obviously it's more similar to Homo rudolfensis, or what would then be Australopithecus rudolfensis, so it would fall in there as well. You see the problem, right? And like what Collard and Wood are suggesting is that this can kind of be circumvented if you're using that adaptive strategy. And like the second that you can clock a hominin behaving in this particular way and having the morphologic criteria to aid it in behaving in that certain way, that's going to be how we define genus Homo. But like I'm struggling to see how that set of criteria doesn't also fall victim to the example problem that I just mentioned. And like I said, I'm not going to go through this piece by piece, but you should go check this out if you want details on like how they actually come to the conclusion that ergaster onward meet the criteria, whereas habilis and rudolfensis do not. But I'm going to sum it up by these sort of last sections here in bold. They say, we suggest that if genus Homo is to have any meaning, its lower boundary should mark a distinct shift in hominin adaptive strategy involving morphological and behavioral innovations. In other words, it should be a new adaptive type. The additional imperative challenge is that this adaptive shift should be capable of identification in the hominin fossil record. And I think the biggest problem is identified by them right here, right? The challenge is that how do you clock it in the hominin fossil record? Right? Because the morphology is going to come after the change in behavior. So it's going to be a part of the Homo clade, or the Homo group, before it's actually going to show up that way within the fossil record. And I don't personally think that that's sufficient. Personally, I think that your criteria for determining where a specimen falls, or where a species falls within really any section of paleontology, but in this sense, paleoanthropology, should be universally applicable to all the specimens, right? So like that's why empirical physical criteria are most commonly utilized to like say, okay, this is more similar to genus Homo, or this is more similar to genus Paranthropus, or Australopithecus, or Ardipithecus, or whatever, instead of like using behavior as sort of this other tangentially related suite of criteria. And like another problem for that is like you're not going to have behavior preserved for everything, right? Just because you don't find material culture associated with the hominin doesn't mean it didn't have material culture after all. And I think that this particular suite of criteria, this particular methodology, is going to be subject to more and more problems the more fossils we actually discover, right? Because as we close the gaps between two specimens, it becomes harder and harder to parse out where one species ends and another begins, or in fact where one genus ends and another begins, if we're looking at the relationship between Australopithecus and Homo. And like that's exactly what we expect under the lens of evolutionary theory, but that doesn't make our jobs easy. So like I said, that paper came out in 1999, and Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis remain in genus Homo, so it seems to me that the general general perception of the paleoanthropological community was basically like, though the physical criteria are still kind of our best methods here moving forward, and they still land habilis and rudolfensis in genus Homo. And indeed, later on in 2016, we start to see sort of reassessment of this boundary between Australopithecus and Homo after almost a decade, well, actually over a decade of additional finds. And I think it's very informative for where we stand now and where we'll move with the last paper. So let's talk about the next one. So here we have From Australopithecus to Homo, The Transition That Wasn't by Bill Kimbel and Brian Villmoare. And I love this paper. I read it like at the exact same time as I read the other one for my hominin evolution class. And this one's actually pretty funny because creationists use the headline from this all the time to be like, see, human evolution bad. And I think it's funny because like they don't even read the abstract, obviously, because the point here is that the gradient is so smooth that you can't actually draw a distinct line. So let's read the abstract because I think this abstract is killer and it summarizes where we stand right now actually quite well, and then we'll dig into the paper a little bit more before moving on. So they say, although the transition from Australopithecus to Homo is usually thought of as a momentous transformation, the fossil record bearing on the origin and earliest evolution of Homo is virtually undocumented. As a result, the poles of the transition are frequently attached to taxa, so Australopithecus afarensis versus Homo habilis, in which substantial adaptive differences have accumulated over significant spans of independent evolution. Such comparisons, in which temporally remote and adaptively divergent species are used to identify a transition, lend credence to the idea that genera should be conceived of at once as monophyletic clades and adaptively unified grades. So what he's saying here, what they're saying, I guess I should say, is that, because of the species that we're looking at, it makes sense to use clades and grades in order to identify where one genus ends and another begins. However, when the problem is recast in terms of lineages rather than taxa per se, the adaptive criterion becomes a problem of subjectively privileging key characteristics from what is typically a stepwise pattern of acquisition of novel characters, beginning in the basal representatives of a clade. And this is fair in something that I didn't mention previously, right? But let's say that you say your criteria for genus Homo are a face that is this flat, a brain case that is this big, and this tool culture. Well, what if it had all three of those things? Like it just barely passes the threshold of a big enough brain, a flat enough face, and the most basic tools allowed, but then every other character is still Australopith-like, right? Like where do you place it? You're privileging those characteristics over others in such a way as to kind of make it a momentous transformation when it really isn't. This is the pattern inferred for species usually included in early Homo, including Homo erectus, which is often cast as in the role of the earliest human-like hominin. A fresh look at brain size, hand morphology, and earliest technology suggests that a number of key Homo attributes may already be present in generalized species of Australopithecus, and that the adaptive distinctions in Homo are simply amplifications or extensions of the ancient hominin trends. So thus far, right, we can appreciate that in 2016, when this was published, we had sufficiently additional material to say that no, it doesn't seem like there is a clear distinction that marks any hominin, including Homo erectus, which, if you'll remember from the 1999 paper, was considered like, okay, this is firmly genus Homo, check. At least we know that that one is for sure in the genus. Like, even that is sharing basal characteristics that link it inexorably to Australopithecus in such a way that it's only by privileging characteristics that you can sort of say this thing is clearly in genus Homo to the exclusion of Australopithecus. He talks a little bit about here, or they talk about a little bit here. I always think in my head that this is like Bill Kimball's paper, but Villmoare is obviously also on it, and I should be more thoughtful of that. So talking about that 1999 paper, they say, from the latter view, following time's vector, the adaptive profile of Homo erectus in some ways now appears more similar to that of phylogenetically more basal species of the Homo clade, including Homo habilis, which would in collaborative argue are sufficiently dissimilar in adaptive profile to Homo to warrant their removal from the genus. The change in perspective is because the pattern of acquisition in the suite of human-like adaptive features in the early Pleistocene Homo appears to have been much more piecemeal, not to say gradual, than previously appreciated, underscoring the essentially arbitrary nature of adaptive grades once their mode of construction and phylogeny is taken into account. So they talk about some of the characteristics, the physical characteristics that place Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis, as well as like this third kind of early Homo erectus, late early genus Homo specimen, how they kind of occupy this intermediate space between bona fide Homo erectus sensu stricto and late Australopithecus. And they talk about the skull's position and also the postcrania. They talk a lot about the intermediate nature of the teeth, and then we have this nice figure 5 here that shows the overlap in brain case size of Australopithecus, early genus Homo, and early Homo erectus. And again, I'm not going to go over this piece by piece because I've got a big transitional hominin video that is still in the works on all of that. But all of this to say, I think they make a really nice case for the legitimacy of the mosaic nature of Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis, and also kind of why it should be in genus Homo. That's best outlined in the conclusion. In the conclusion short, so I'm going to read the whole thing. The fossil record bearing on the ancestry of Pleistocene Homo is poor. However, the more we learn about early Homo, the less compelling is the case for an adaptive shift that can be read from currently documented skull and skeletal anatomy as a major transition from generalized Australopithecus precursors. So he's basically saying, like, based off of what we have, there is no clear demarcation between late Australopithecus and really any of genus Homo all the way up to, like, definitive Homo erectus, and even that doesn't show like a clear delineation from what came before. Early phylogenetically basal species of the Homo clade resemble generalized Australopiths more than they do later species of the clade, as expected from a Darwinian pattern of descent with modification. These and subsequent transitional species of the Homo lineage erode the impression of distinct adaptive suites created by comparisons between terminal taxa or those separated by large temporal gaps. So he's saying, like, the more we find, the harder it is to find, again, any level of clear demarcation. Although it is easier when you're looking at big temporally separated species, like something, 2 species separated by 2 million years, you're obviously going to see what appears to be a clear delineation, but if you fill in that gap, you see that it's a lot more stepwise than people tend to give it credit for, or indeed people have given it credit for in the past. The epigraph heading of this paper indicates that Darwin himself recognized this as a probable outcome of descent with modification given a growing fossil record. This argument has been recently updated by Cartmel, and they give the source for that. This recognition is not, however, a paean to the wholesale phyletic or gradual evolution in Homo, as was commonly asserted half a century ago. The African fossil record of Homo demonstrates diversity quite clearly between 2 and 1.7 million years ago, and there are hints of it as far back as 2.4. It is rather an argument against adaptive unity as a biologically necessary adjunct to monophyly in the definition of the genus category. Whether or not we choose to adopt the large number of super-specific taxonomic ranks and their associated taxon names dictated by a bushy hominin clade is not a pressing scientific matter in the quest to understand human origin. So he's like, where you put them is ultimately pointless. The most important thing is to actually look at the change that's occurring. Like, what do the specimens present, not what are they called? Of greater importance can be counted as recent arguments for the use or manufacture of stone tools in time periods predating by some 500,000 years the earliest Homo fossils so far known, and the potential they have to shrink the adaptive space between Homo and Australopithecus still further. Because, like, again, if Australopithecus is using tools, what really separates early Homo from late Australopithecus? Indeed, the expanded brain size, human-like wrist and hand anatomy, dietary eclecticism, and potential tool-making capabilities of generalized Australopiths root the Homo lineage in ancient hominin adaptive strategies and trends, suggesting that the transition from Australopithecus to Homo may not have been that much of a transition at all. So this paper makes some pretty good cases as to why we shouldn't use grades, and what I think is even more important is it does a really great job summarizing the intermediate mosaic position of early genus Homo and how basically every characteristic that we utilize to clock genus Homo, especially early genus Homo, is found in earlier forms in Australopithecus, meaning everything that's done in genus Homo is just a continuation of a trend. And thus the transition from Australopithecus to Homo isn't really much of a transition. It's the continuation of business as usual under continuous selective pressure. But my favorite part about this paper is their insistence that this is exactly what we should expect and exactly what Darwin predicted. Why at any point did we suppose that whatever makes humans humans would appear suddenly and explosively in the fossil record in such a way as to distinctly separate us from everything else? That's not typically how evolution works. the really cool and weird things about us have precursors, and those precursors are super ancient. I think that the paper also makes a pretty decent case that although most lines in taxonomy, especially if you're talking about anagenetic genera, are going to be pretty arbitrary, based off of how we typically define genus Homo and what we prioritize in Homo sapiens, Homo habilis is probably a pretty good first member. So this sentiment actually continues pretty firmly to this day, as seen in a paper released earlier this month titled Dental Morphology in Homo habilis and its implications for the evolution of early genus Homo. This paper is open access, baby, so we can go through as much of it as we want. So the abstract goes through the basis of their findings, right? They're looking specifically at the teeth, and with regard to the teeth, they're looking at the enamel-dentin junction. So this is actually an internal portion of the tooth where the enamel ends and the dentin begins. And the reason they chose this is because it's pretty safe from wear typically, whereas the upper portion of the enamel, the exposed surface of the tooth, is often worn down and it can lose detail. So they say geometric morphometrics is used to characterize the dentin crown shape and size across the entire mandibular and maxillary tooth rows. Compared with a broad comparative sample, we find that EDJ morphology in Homo habilis is for the most part remarkably primitive, supporting the hypothesis that the Homo habilis hypodyme has more in common with Australopithecus than later Homo. I like this as a sentence because to me and most people who I think saw this paper, it's like, wow, really? That's crazy. You're telling me that the earliest member of genus Homo shares more in common with the preceding genus than late members of its own genus? Who would have thought? Although I'm not demeaning the paper, you have to say this stuff in papers, right? You have to spell it out, but I just like that as a sentence. Additionally, the chronologically younger specimen of OH16 displays a suite of derived characteristics and features. Its inclusion in Homo habilis leads to excessive levels of variation. The implication of that last part being like a sort of wink wink nudge nudge, maybe it shouldn't be in Homo habilis so that we can keep the variation reasonable. And then the question is, okay, well, where does it belong? So here's a cool figure, figure 2. You can see what they mean when they talk about the enamel dentin junction. So the enamel is the hardest part of the tooth, right? It's the tooth cap. It grows on the outer portion, and the dentin is sort of the softer portion of the tooth right over the pulp underneath. So the dentin structure is not going to be an exact mirror of the enamel above it, but it's going to reflect to some degree the pattern. So they did a principal component analysis to look at the maxillary and mandibular P3, P4, so the third and fourth premolar, and then the first molar. So here is figure 3 with the EDJ shape variation in the mandibular third premolars. And what you can see here in red is this is Australopithecus. Later Homo is over here in purple, and just so you know, later Homo here includes late Pleistocene Homo sapiens, Homo sapiens like anatomically modern, and Neanderthals. Homo erectus is not included in the majority of later Homo, to my understanding here. And what you can see is that a lot of our Homo habilis specimens and things that are kind of adjacent to Homo habilis, but are still maybe a little bit up in the air, are over here by where Australopithecus is, with the exclusion of OH16, which is the only member of Homo habilis or Homo habilis adjacent that ends up close to genus Homo. OH22 is Homo ergaster, so African Homo erectus, and then a lot of Homo erectus is over here by Australopithecus. So the point here is that in mandibular third premolars, change that leads us to anatomically modern Homo sapiens occurs pretty late in the evolution of hominins, and that a lot of things that we consider to be pretty derived are still exhibiting pretty primitive third premolars. So you've got a nice little shape space analysis here. Taking a look at figure 4, which is the fourth premolar, things are a lot closer. So this suggests, I like this as a figure because it shows us Homo erectus is directly spanning the difference between Australopithecus and later genus Homo, with the members of Homo habilis sort of dotting alongside Homo erectus, but a little bit more basal, precisely what we would expect. And moving down to the maxillary first molar, so it's the upper first molar, same situation, right? Homo erectus is spanning the distance between Australopithecus and later genus Homo, precisely as we would expect temporally. The discussion has some important points to make with those tables in mind. So we begin with a suite of enamel dentin junction features distinguishes the post-canine teeth, so the premolars and the molars, of later genus Homo, so again, that's Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, from Australopithecus. Okay, cool, we expect that. However, when considering the traits in early genus Homo, we find that Homo habilis specimens largely retain the Australopithecus condition. Cool. So Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis look more like Australopithecus than they do later genus Homo, and Homo erectus sort of kind of spans that gap, especially in the fourth premolar and the first molar. So you might be thinking, okay, well, why didn't they look at the second and the third molar? That's what I thought when we were looking at those figures above. And the reason is because the Homo habilis M2 and M3 shapes are distinct from the other groups, more broadly speaking. So they're like uniquely derived, which is kind of neat to think about, and says perhaps a little bit about like the adaptive niche that Homo habilis is occupying. They talk a little bit more about the derived characteristics in Homo habilis, and they go on to say that the general pattern that we see in Homo habilis, even taking into account those derived characteristics, is overall Australopithecus-like in the endostructural dental morphology of the earliest members of our genus, which is not super surprising. And then they talk about what we've been discussing today. Alternatively, some have advocated for the entire hypodymes of Homo habilis and or Homo rudolfensis to be transferred out of genus Homo. They suggest that the inclusion of these species in Homo could render the genus paraphyletic, which is supported by some older phylogenetic analyses. However, it is important to mention that several more recent phylogenetic studies have supported the monophyly of Homo, even with the inclusion of Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis, although in certain instances, maintaining this monophyly might necessitate a reconsideration of the generic status of Australopithecus sediba, Homo naledi, and or Homo floresiensis. It has also been argued that species included in Homo should occupy a coherent adaptive grade. Who do you think this citation is? Hey, it's wooden colored, 1999. And that plesiomorphic features across Homo habilis' skeleton suggest an adaptive strategy more similar to Australopithecus than Homo sapiens. Others have argued against the requirement for genera to be adaptively unified. Who do you think this one is? Hey, it's Kimbel and Villmoare, emphasizing the adaptation seen in Homo sapiens evolved in mosaic stepwise patterns, and that the distinction between Australopithecus and the earliest members of genus Homo is necessarily slight. The results presented here highlight a number of plesiomorphic features across Homo habilis dentition that emphasize the species' morphological and adaptive distinction from later members of genus Homo, but whether this justifies removing the species from Homo depends on the definition of the genus. They spend a bit of time talking about where OH16, that one member of Homo habilis that seemed to be more closely aligned with later genus Homo, should belong, but really I just wanted to go over this paper as sort of a capstone to the debate on where habilis and rudolfensis actually belong, and I think the paper really summed it up well. It depends on how you define genus Homo, and in my opinion, and I think this is generally speaking the consensus opinion, if you're using suites of morphologic characteristics consistently across hominin evolution, Homo habilis is the earliest member of genus Homo, a pretty primitive member of genus Homo, but that is exactly what we should expect under the lens of evolutionary theory. This was meant to be like a quick look at where we should put Homo habilis and like different people's opinions of where we should place it, as well as where the current consensus stands. Naturally, it ended up being like over half an hour long, because that's what always happens when I decide that a video is going to be brief. It never is. Or you could look at it a different way. It's brief by my standards. I hope you liked it though. This was a fun one to make. I just kind of wanted an excuse to talk about Homo habilis because I don't talk about it very much. If you like what I do, please consider supporting me in the free way. That's liking, commenting, and subscribing. And if you want to help me out in an even bigger way, you can join my Patreon. Those guys get their names at the end of videos, and they sometimes get early access to like videos when I'm on schedule, which isn't common, but I do feel like it's over 50% of the time. So take that for what you will. And in the meantime, you guys, I'll see you real soon next time.